At 11:02 in the morning on August 9th, 1945, a single weapon rewrites a city. The bomb falls for 43 seconds before the detonation sequence completes its final arithmetic. There is no warning audible to anyone in Nagasaki, no siren, no shadow of wings passing low over the rooftops, nothing but the ordinary August sky above a coastal city sitting at the foot of its hills. Then a point of light appears where no point of light belongs, and the world inside a 1-mile radius ceases to exist in the form it held the instant before. The fireball expands outward at temperatures beyond what ordinary physics bothers to name for human convenience. Within a mile of ground zero, everything is annihilated. 14,000 homes catch fire in the same moment. The blast yield measures approximately 21 kilotons of TNT, a figure that belongs to engineering reports, not to any vocabulary adequate to what the people of Nagasaki experience in those seconds. By the time the fires begin to slow, 1.8 square miles of the city have been flattened. Perhaps 40,000 people are dead from the initial detonation alone. 30,000 more will die before the beginning of 1946, from burns, from radiation sickness, from injuries for which the physicians still alive to treat them have no precedent and no adequate supply. The B-29 that carries the bomb is called Boxcar. It has been piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, who lifted the aircraft off the runway at Tinian Island at 3:47 in the morning, while the Pacific night was still complete and the stars above the Marianas were still sharp. Sweeney and his crew have flown nearly 6 hours by the time they reach Japan, navigating fuel complications and weather that nearly redirects the mission entirely. None of that matters in the end. The bomb finds Nagasaki. The city ceases to be what it was, 8,000 miles to the east, in a Washington moving through its own August morning. Humid, government still, the capital settling into the rhythms of a wartime Tuesday. The news arrives in fragments. The first reports are radioed back from the observation aircraft that fly alongside Boxcar, then pass through the chain of Pacific Command. By the time the information reaches the War Department and the White House, it has been processed into the measured language of official confirmation. The second atomic weapon has been used. The second bomb has fallen. In the corridors of power, the immediate reaction is something close to relief seasoned with expectation. Henry Stimson, the 77-year-old Secretary of War, has lived his entire professional life in service of a measured calculus, the kind of man who weighs policy in long paragraphs, who considers the second and third consequence before speaking to the first. Stimson and those around the president have watched the Hiroshima strike 3 days earlier and calculated, with the confidence of men who believe in the logic of overwhelming force, that Japan would soon capitulate. The second bomb, in their calculus, is the closing argument in a case already made, the emphatic period at the end of a sentence whose meaning ought to be obvious to Tokyo. What no one in Washington yet knows, on the morning of August 9th, is how many days that argument will take to land and what will happen in the interval. 6,000 miles from the White House, on an island the American public would not have been able to locate on a map 6 months earlier, another man is reading the same intelligence with a different set of instincts. Guam is green and tropical in the way Pacific islands are green. Coral-lit water at the reef line, jungle inland, the coral runways at Northfield and Northwestfield, scored into the plateau above the sea. It is the operational nerve of the Marianas Air Campaign. It is also, in August 1945, the headquarters of 21st Bomber Command, and inside the plain wooden buildings that serve as its command post, Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay is not treating the Nagasaki strike as an ending. He's treating it as one more variable in a target planning cycle that has not paused since March. LeMay is 38 years old. He is short, thickly built, given to the perpetual chewing of an unlit cigar because a doctor once told him tobacco smoke aggravated a facial nerve condition that already pulled the corner of his mouth into a permanent scowl. He speaks in short, blunt sentences. He does not tolerate ceremony. He took command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Marianas in January of 1945, and within weeks he had discarded the doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing that his predecessors had laboured to enforce over Japanese industrial targets. The doctrine had not worked. Japanese weather, jet stream winds at bombing altitude, and dispersed cottage industry manufacturing had defeated it. LeMay's answer was to strip the B-29s of most of their defensive armament, load them with incendiaries, send them in at low altitude at night, and burn Japanese cities to the ground. The doctrinal turning point had come on the night of March 9th, and into the morning of March 10th, 1945. 334 B-29s had crossed Tokyo at altitudes as low as 5,000 feet, and dropped napalm and magnesium incendiary sticks over the densely built wooden neighbourhoods of the eastern city. The resulting firestorm consumed roughly 16 square miles in a single night. Between that raid and the raids that followed in the same 9-day window, Nagoya on the 11th and 12th, Osaka on the 13th and 14th, Kobe on the 16th and 17th, Nagoya again on the 18th and 19th, a total of 9,373 tons of bombs had come down on the 4 largest industrial cities of the Japanese home islands, destroying 31 square miles of urban area in aggregate. That week established the pattern. Everything LeMay did after was a continuation and refinement of that pattern. By August 9th, when Bockscar releases its plutonium implosion device over Nagasaki, LeMay's campaign has been running at industrial cadence for 5 months. The list of Japanese cities that have been substantially burned, in whole or in part, runs to more than 60. The B-29 force in the Marianas has grown to nearly 1,000 aircraft. The pipeline of incendiaries, the M69 clusters, the napalm-filled tail-finned bomblets that scatter over rooftops and stick to wood, is running at scale from stateside factories to the loading pits on Tinian, Saipan and Guam. Fuel, replacement crews, replacement aircraft, ordnance, the machine is not slowing. From LeMay's operational vantage, the 2 atomic strikes are not the closing of a campaign. They are 2 very large sorties nested inside a campaign that is still running, still generating targets, still consuming Japanese urban and industrial capacity at the rate of several cities per week. The target list on his desk in the second week of August reflects this reality. It is not a document of pause, it is a document of continuation. Near the top of the priority queue sits the Osaka-Kobe rail complex, the throat of the Japanese domestic rail system, the interchange through which the Kansai region's traffic in raw material, finished ordnance, food and manpower moves. Osaka is the second largest city in Japan. Before the war it held 3 million residents, and even after the March incendiary attacks and the follow-on raids of June and July, it retains the physical infrastructure of Japan's principal industrial spine, shipbuilding facilities along the Yodo River estuary, iron and steel works, rolling stock plants, ordnance factories that had spent the previous decade turning out the components of Army and Navy production. Kobe, immediately to the west along the inland sea coast, is Japan's largest port. Its docks and machine works handle steel, rubber processing machinery, railway equipment, and naval ordnance. The rail line that runs between them, the same corridor that in peacetime carries the daily commuter traffic of a densely urbanized industrial region, is in LeMay's ledger a single interlocked system of throughput. To break it is to strangle Japanese logistics in the Kansai. To break it repeatedly, to keep breaking it faster than the Japanese can repair it, is the objective. Further west along the coast of Honshu sits another entry on the list, the Hikari Naval Arsenal on the inland sea in Yamaguchi Prefecture. Hikari is not a household name in the American public imagination, the way Nagoya or Kobe or Osaka have become. It does not need to be. Inside LeMay's target folders, it is a specific complex of buildings producing specific ordnance for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Torpedo components, gun assemblies, the finished hardware of the fleet that the surface war in the Pacific has largely reduced to a coastal defense force, but that Japanese doctrine still counts on for the defense of the home islands against invasion. The arsenal has been marked, ranged, photographed by reconnaissance flights. It is a place LeMay's planners know how to reach. And there is the oil. What remains of Japanese oil infrastructure on Honshu after the July raids constitutes a diminished but still meaningful set of targets: refining capacity, storage tank farms, the small remaining reserve of processed aviation gasoline that the Japanese air arm has been husbanding against the anticipated invasion. Japan's strategic petroleum position had collapsed months earlier, once the American submarine campaign closed the tanker routes from the southern resources area, and the mining of the Shimonoseki Strait sealed the inland sea against the last of the coastwise shipping. But collapse is not zero. The reserve tanks that remain, the refining facilities that still operate at reduced capacity, the aviation fuel stockpiles that the Japanese Army and Navy are holding for kamikaze operations against an American invasion fleet. These are on the list. The pattern of the previous weeks tells the story of how LeMay works. On August 1st, more than 830 B-29s had struck Hachioji, Mito, Nagaoka, and Toyama in a single coordinated maximum effort operation. Toyama, an aluminum-producing city on the Sea of Japan coast, had suffered 99% area destruction, a figure so extreme that even inside the American command structure it required a second look. 99%. There is no rounding that number upward. The city of Toyama, in a single night of incendiary attack, had ceased to function as a city. That was 8 days before Nagasaki. LeMay has a phrase he has used, and that others around him have heard him use, that expresses his operating philosophy with the compression of a man who does not enjoy speeches. If the war is shortened by a single day, the attack will have served its purpose. It is not a phrase constructed for public consumption. It is the internal calculus of a commander who has looked at the numbers, calculated the daily rate of American and Allied casualties across the Pacific and China-Burma-India theatres, calculated the daily rate at which Japanese forces continue to inflict those casualties, and reached the conclusion that the fastest path to fewer American graves is the fastest path to Japanese surrender. In LeMay's arithmetic, the incendiary campaign is not a war crime and not a moral question. It is an accelerant, a means of collapsing the timeline between now and the moment when Tokyo agrees to lay down arms. Which is why, in the second week of August 1945, with the smoke still rising over Nagasaki and the wires from Tokyo not yet clarified, LeMay's staff is not standing down. They're updating. The target folders are being pulled, updated with the latest reconnaissance overlays, cross-reference with weather forecasts and predicted cloud cover along the Honshu and Kyushu approach corridors. The maintenance shops on Guam and Tinian and Saipan are cycling B-29s through their inspection intervals to keep the aircraft in commission rate as high as possible. Ordnance is being moved to the pits. Crews are being scheduled. The atomic bombs in LeMay's Guam headquarters register as an accelerant, not as an interruption. His campaign is designed to continue until it is told to stop, and no one has told him to stop. Above LeMay in the operational chain of command sits another man, at a headquarters some distance from Guam but connected by the same signal traffic, and it is in his office that the third atomic bomb, the one that has not yet been used and might yet be, becomes a concrete question rather than an abstract possibility. Lieutenant General Carl Andrew Spaatz is 54 years old, a career airman with the trimmed moustache and the deliberate calm of a man who has spent the last 2 years of the European war running the American strategic bombing offensive against Germany. He has been in the Pacific only a matter of weeks. His posting to command US strategic air forces in the Pacific has placed him above LeMay in the operational structure and made him the officer through whom the atomic bomb orders flow. Where LeMay is blunt and unadorned, Spaatz is more measured, more accustomed to the diplomatic textures of coalition command. But the arithmetic in his in-tray, in the second week of August, is not diplomatic. It is very specific. The orders under which Spaatz operates on the atomic weapons are the orders that had been issued to him on July 25, 1945, before Hiroshima, before Nagasaki, before Potsdam had run its full course. Those orders had been drafted at the War Department, approved by Secretary of War Stimson and by Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, and transmitted to Spaatz in language whose implications are worth reading closely. They stipulated that additional bombs will be delivered on the above targets as soon as made ready by the project staff, and that further instructions concerning targets other than those listed above would follow. That language is not, on its face, a limit. It is a permission structure. It is an order in plain terms that permits the dropping of as many atomic bombs as the Manhattan Project can supply, against targets on an approved list, subject to further instruction on targets not yet named. It does not require the President's authorization before each use. It does not build in a pause between the second bomb and the third. It contemplates a sequence. On August 10th, the day after Nagasaki, that sequence becomes newly concrete. Major General Leslie Groves, the Army engineer who has run the Manhattan Project from its earliest laboratories to its production reactors at Hanford and its plutonium refinement chain, writes to Marshall in Washington with a specific readiness estimate. The next bomb, Groves reports, should be ready for delivery on the first suitable weather after the 17th or 18th of August. The device will be a plutonium implosion weapon, a Fat Man design, the same architecture as the Nagasaki bomb, cored with a plutonium-239 pit that is at this moment in the final stages of the assembly and safety testing pipeline at Los Alamos. It will be flown to the Pacific, staged through the same chain of custody that produced the first two, and made available for use against a Japanese target on approximately 1 week's timeline from the date of Groves's memorandum. Marshall reads the memorandum, and on the memorandum in his own hand, Marshall writes an annotation that changes the meaning of the entire authorization structure. It is not to be released over Japan, Marshall writes, without express authority from the President. That annotation is not a public document. It is not, in August 1945, a formal executive order, not a signed presidential directive, not a policy paper transmitted to the theatre command. It is a general's handwritten note on a memorandum, but it is the note of the Army Chief of Staff, and it establishes, for the first time in the atomic weapons chain of custody, that the third bomb will not follow the same authorization pathway as the first two. Marshall has, in effect, seized the reins from below the President and pulled the horse to a stop. He has said, the third one waits, but, and this is the critical operational fact of the 6-day window that follows, Truman has not yet said stop. Truman has not been asked in any formal sense to say stop. What Marshall has done is insert a decision gate that did not exist in the July 25th orders. The gate is now present, but no one has closed it and no one has opened it. The bomb, when it is ready, will sit at the gate. Spaatz in the Pacific is not idle in the face of this waiting. He is a commander preparing for a mission he may be asked to execute on short notice. On both August 10th and August 14th, he sends telegrams up the chain recommending that if a third atomic weapon is used, the target should be Tokyo, recommending this with what the record describes as utmost urgency. His reasoning is operational, not sentimental. The candidate target list for the third bomb, as it stands in the target folders, includes Kokura, which had been the primary target on August 9th, before weather diverted Sweeney's crew to Nagasaki. It includes Niigata on the Sea of Japan coast, which had been on the original Manhattan Project target list from the beginning. It includes Yokohama, though Yokohama has already been heavily damaged by conventional incendiary raids in May. Spartz's argument for Tokyo is that if the point of the third bomb is to break the Japanese government's will to continue the war, the government itself must be the pressure point. Kokura and Niigata are industrial cities. Tokyo is the capital. The distinction, in Spartz's argument, is not one of scale, but of political effect. The chain of command that will resolve this question runs from Spartz to Marshall, to Stimson to Truman. It is a four-step chain, and in the second week of August it is a chain none of whose links has yet made a definitive decision. Spartz recommends Tokyo. Marshall has said the president must authorize. Stimson has not weighed in on target selection. Truman has not been formally presented with the choice. The bomb is being assembled at Los Alamos. The delivery aircraft is on Tinian. The crew that will fly the mission has been designated. The target folder is open on multiple desks. And no one, from the president down through the theatre commander, has said either yes or no. This is the reframing that the third bomb imposes on the entire six-day window between Nagasaki and the surrender. The question, in Washington and in the Pacific, is not simply whether Japan will accept the Potsdam terms. It is whether, if Japan does not accept them quickly enough, a third Japanese city will be destroyed. The clock is not the diplomatic clock alone. It is also the assembly line clock at Los Alamos and the readiness clock on Tinian, converging on a date approximately 1 week out. Inside the White House on August 10th, none of this operational scaffolding is the first item of business. The first item of business, when the president convenes his cabinet advisors in the Oval Office on the morning after Nagasaki, is a diplomatic cable that has arrived from Tokyo overnight. Early on the morning of August 10th, the Japanese Foreign Ministry has transmitted through the neutral Swiss and Swedish diplomatic channels that have carried the war's most sensitive communications a formal statement. Japan will accept the Potsdam Declaration. It will accept the terms laid down by the United States, the United Kingdom, and China at the Potsdam Conference in July. But it will do so with one condition. The Japanese acceptance is contingent upon the understanding that the declaration does not include any demand that would, in the Japanese Foreign Ministry's specific and much past phrasing, prejudice the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler, the prerogatives of the Emperor. The sentence lands in Washington in the small hours and by daylight has been translated, retranslated, cabled to the appropriate desks, and placed on the President's morning reading. It is the first substantive Japanese diplomatic response to the atomic strikes and the Soviet declaration of war. It is not an unconditional surrender. It is very close to one. But that one clause, the prerogatives of the Emperor, is the entire question. Truman convenes his advisers. Around the table in the Oval Office that morning are Stimson, the 77-year-old Secretary of War, whose exhaustion is visible but whose intellect is engaged; Secretary of State James F. Burns, the former South Carolina Senator and Supreme Court Justice, who has been Truman's closest political confidant since taking the State Department portfolio in July; Secretary of the Navy James Vist, Forrestal, cerebral and intense, and Joseph Grew, acting Secretary of State, a career diplomat and, critically, the former United States ambassador to Tokyo, who had lived in Japan for a decade before the war and who understands the imperial institution not as an abstraction, but as a functioning political system. The meeting is not shouted. Truman's cabinet meetings rarely are. But the disagreement inside the room is fundamental, and it splits the participants along a line that will determine the wording of the American response, and through that wording the timeline of the war's end. On one side of the disagreement is Burns. His position, argued with the political sharpness of a man who has spent 30 years reading Senate cloakrooms and campaign platforms, is that the United States should go no further than it had been willing to go at Potsdam. Potsdam had demanded unconditional surrender. Potsdam had not offered guarantees on the Emperor. To offer such guarantees now, Burns argues, is to reward the Japanese for holding out through 2 atomic strikes and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria. It is to signal that American resolve can be negotiated. And it is, in Burns's political reading, unsurvivable at home. The American public, which has spent nearly 4 years absorbing the language of Pearl Harbor and Bataan and unconditional surrender, will not accept an armistice that preserves the sovereignty of the man in whose name Pearl Harbor was attacked. Burns's line is hard. No guarantee, no softening. The Japanese either accept the Potsdam terms without qualification, or they receive whatever comes next. On the other side sit Grew and Stimson. Their argument is not moral, it is functional. Grew, who has stood in the palace precincts of Tokyo and watched the Japanese government operate, argues that the Emperor is not simply a figurehead whom the American occupation can dispose of at leisure. The Emperor is the one instrument by which any surrender order can be transmitted to Japanese armies in the field and obeyed. Overseas commanders, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, the southern area forces in the vast archipelagos and mainland positions of Southeast Asia, control between 1/4 and 1/3 of all Japanese servicemen under arms. Those commanders have already indicated through their own signal traffic and through what American intelligence has been able to intercept, that they will not comply with the surrender they regard as illegitimate. The Emperor is the only figure whose authority can override that resistance. If the American terms make the Emperor's position impossible, if they demand that the Japanese government sign a document its own military will not honor, then the surrender is not a surrender. It is a piece of paper. The war continues in the field, and the invasion of Kyushu, planned for November, proceeds as scheduled. Stimson agrees. He has agreed for months. The Secretary of War has in fact been arguing since before Potsdam that some form of assurance regarding the imperial institution would be necessary to secure a rapid Japanese surrender, and had been overruled or set aside each time. Now, with the second bomb dropped and the Japanese offer on the table, Stimson argues again, more urgently, that the fastest path to actual, as opposed to notional, surrender runs through the preservation of the throne. Truman listens. Around the table, Admiral William D. Leahy, the President's Chief of Staff, also inclines toward acceptance of the Japanese note. According to Burns's own account of the meeting, Truman, Stimson and Leahy favor accepting the Japanese offer. Burns objects. The room is not evenly divided, but Burns's objection carries the political weight of the Secretary of State, and it carries Truman's ear. The President has known Burns longer than he has known most of the men in the cabinet. He trusts Burns's political instincts, and Burns is telling him, in the plain terms of a man who does not soften his advice, that going further than Potsdam is a political mistake the administration cannot afford. The meeting does not end with agreement. It ends with a task. Someone will draft a reply. The reply will thread the needle between Burns's insistence on Potsdam's terms and Grew and Stimson's insistence that the Emperor be given some room within which to function. The drafting will fall to Burns himself. What is written that day, and cabled to Tokyo through the Swiss Foreign Affairs Department on August 12th, will become known inside the State Department and the historical record as the Burns Note. It is a document of precise diplomatic wording, calibrated to say a specific thing to Tokyo and something slightly different to the American public, and something else again to the Allied governments whose approval, from London, from Chongqing, from Moscow, must be secured before transmission. Its language will occupy the next chapter of this story. But the atmosphere in the Oval Office on the morning of August 10th, as the meeting breaks up and the cabinet officers return to their departments, is not the atmosphere of resolution. It is the atmosphere of a decision made under pressure and against dissent, with the knowledge that the wording of the reply will shape not only the terms of the peace, but the number of days between now and its arrival, and the number of Japanese cities, and the number of American and Japanese lives that will fall inside that interval. Careers hang on the phrasing. Political legacies hang on the phrasing. Hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides of the Pacific hang on the phrasing. And in Guam, LeMay's target list is still open on the desk. And on Tinian, the ground crews are still readying B-29s. And at Los Alamos, the plutonium core for the third bomb is still moving through its final assembly. The Burns Note arrives on James Burns's desk as a problem of language, not of intent. Intent has already been decided, however imperfectly, by the meeting in the Oval Office, but of the specific English words that will carry that intent across the Pacific, through the Swiss Foreign Affairs Department, into the hands of Japanese translators who will pass every syllable for evidence of what America actually means. Burns knows, as any former senator knows, that the most powerful clauses in legislation are the ones that seem to say nothing at all. And what he needs now is a sentence that will satisfy Harry Truman, satisfy the American public, satisfy Clement Attlee in London, and Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing, and the Soviets in Moscow, who have entered the Pacific War only days earlier, and whose enthusiasm for generous surrender terms is, to put it mildly, restrained, and simultaneously leave enough room for Hirohito to read the words and conclude that he is not being asked to sign his own political death warrant. The Japanese note received through Max Grassley, the chargé d'affaires ad interim of Switzerland, had been explicit in its one condition. Surrender would come with the understanding that the said declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. That language is not ambiguous. It means the Emperor retains governing authority. It means no change in Japan's form of government. It means, if taken at face value, that the war and its millions of dead will have produced a Japan that looks, constitutionally, precisely as it looked in 1941. Burns cannot accept that. No American official can accept that and survive the next news cycle. The mothers of the dead at Iwo Jima and Okinawa will not accept that. Congress will not accept that. And Burns, whatever his political calculations, is also a man who believes that the militarist apparatus of Japan must be broken, that the generals who march their country into this war cannot be left in a position to march it into another. But Gru's argument stands. Stimson's argument stands. The Emperor is the single mechanism through which a ceasefire can be transmitted to Japanese forces scattered across an empire that stretches from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies. Without his voice, without his authority, the order to lay down arms will not propagate, and there are 3.5 million Japanese soldiers under arms overseas, many of them in positions where local commanders have no independent means of confirming what Tokyo is or is not saying. So Burns writes. He writes, revises, submits drafts for comment, and writes again. The resulting document, transmitted to the Swiss on August 12th, contains a sentence that will bear the weight of the entire Pacific settlement. From the moment of surrender, The authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, who will take such steps as he deems proper to effectuate the surrender terms. Read one way, the sentence strips Hirohito of sovereignty. Subject to means subordinate to. The supreme commander, everyone knows this will be Douglas MacArthur, will have the power to override, to direct, to reshape. The emperor is not preserved as a ruler, he is preserved as an instrument. Read another way, the sentence preserves the emperor in place. It does not demand abdication. It does not demand trial. It does not say the word remove. It says subject to, and subject to is a relationship, not an execution. Hirohito will sit on the chrysanthemum throne under new management, but he will sit on it. Burns adds a second clause, one that will prove equally important in Tokyo's calculations. The ultimate form of government of Japan shall, in accordance with the Potsdam Declaration, be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. This is democracy as threat and promise simultaneously. If the Japanese people wish to keep their emperor, the clause implies they may keep him. If they do not, they may discard him. The decision is deferred, which is to say, the confrontation is deferred. No one in Washington needs to say the word abolish. No one in Tokyo needs to hear it. The British agree, the Chinese agree, the Soviets agree, though reluctantly. Moscow would prefer harsher terms, would prefer explicit dethronement, but Stalin's leverage in the Pacific is still measured in days, not decades, and he does not press the point beyond objection. The note goes out. It travels through Bern, across encrypted channels toward Tokyo, and now the clock begins again, because the note must arrive, must be translated, must be read by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, must be presented to the Supreme War Council, must be debated, and every hour of that process is an hour in which the bombers are still flying. This is the central, terrible fact of the days between August 11th and August 14th. The diplomatic cable and the bomber stream occupy the same hours, move through the same air, and neither one acknowledges the other. The Burns note satisfies no one completely. It is, in the words of one historian, a little masterpiece of amenable diktat, a document that reads as an ultimatum while functioning as a compromise. It demands the end of the Japanese military regime while promising the Japanese people self-government. It strips Hirohito of his powers as warlord while recrowning him as peacemaker, and it does all of this in language precise enough to survive legal scrutiny and vague enough to survive political scrutiny, which are not the same thing. But survival, in August 1945, is not merely a matter of words surviving scrutiny. It is a matter of cities surviving the night. The bombers have not stopped. There has been no ceasefire order, no stand-down, no signal from Washington or from Guam that the air campaign should pause while the diplomats negotiate. The operational logic is brutally simple and has been articulated by LeMay and affirmed by Sparts. Until a formal unconditional surrender is received and accepted by the United States government, military operations continue. This is not sadism, it is not bloodlust, though neither LeMay nor his staff would express much sentiment about the distinction. It is legal formalism married to strategic doctrine. A war does not end because one side has indicated willingness to discuss ending it. A war ends when the instruments are signed. Until then, the pressure must be maintained because the pressure is what produces the signature. And so the B-29s lift from their hard stands on Guam, on Tinian, on Saipan, their bomb bays loaded with M69 incendiary clusters, and they fly north through the darkness toward Japan. On the nights of August 11th, 12th and 13th, missions proceed against industrial and transportation targets. The target folders have been prepared weeks or months in advance. The Pathfinder crews know their business. The formations assemble over the Marianas, climb to altitude, and drone northward across 1,000 miles of ocean towards cities that have, in many cases, already been substantially destroyed. The raids of August 14th to 15th will become the most remembered. the 1,000-plane maximum effort that is reserved for later telling, but the strikes of the preceding nights are no less real to the people beneath them. On the night of August 14th to 15th, approximately 90 B-29 superfortresses of the 313th Bombardment Wing descend over Kumagaya, a small city in Saitama Prefecture, north of Tokyo. The city's military significance is marginal. A Nakajima Aircraft Company component manufacturing facility, the Imperial Japanese Army's Kumagaya Air Academy. It is not Tokyo. It is not Osaka. It is, in the words of New York Herald Tribune correspondent Homer Bigart, who flies aboard one of the bombers that night, a pathetically small city of little obvious importance. 6,000 tons of napalm fall on Kumagaya. The firestorm that follows kills 266 civilians and injures more than 3,000, roughly 28% of the city's population. The last B-29s clear Kumagaya's skies less than 12 hours before Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice will emerge from radios across Japan announcing unconditional surrender. The crews know. They have been briefed. They are aware the war is all but over. They have been told to monitor their radios for a code word, Utah, which will mean Japan's surrender is official and they may turn back toward Guam. The code word does not come before they reach the target. The bombs fall. Isesaki, another small city, receives the same treatment on the same night. The same incendiary clusters, the same operational logic, the same gap between what the diplomats know and what the air crews are permitted to act on. No one in the bomber stream has the authority to call off the raid. That authority rests in Washington, and Washington has not exercised it, because Washington is waiting for Tokyo's reply to the Burns note, waiting for confirmation that the surrender is real, that it is unconditional in the way Potsdam demands, and that the Japanese government is capable of enforcing it. This is where the story turns inward, toward Tokyo, toward the crisis that American intelligence can sense but cannot fully see, and that drives, more than any other single factor, the decision to keep the bombers flying. The Supreme War Council, the Big Six who govern Japan's war policy, had gathered on August 9th in the wake of Hiroshima, only to learn during the meeting itself of both the Soviet declaration of war and the destruction of Nagasaki. The news arrives in layers, each one worse than the last. The Soviets have invaded Manchuria. A second atomic bomb has been dropped. The city is gone. The deliberations that follow are not deliberations in any ordinary sense. They are a confrontation between two irreconcilable positions, held by men who have known each other for decades, and who understand that the outcome of their argument will determine whether Japan exists as a nation or ceases to exist entirely. On one side, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai. These three advocate acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration with a single proviso, the retention of the imperial institution. They believe the war is lost, has been lost for months, and that further resistance will produce only further destruction without altering the outcome. On the other side, War Minister Korichika Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Suemu Toyoda. These three refuse, not partially, not conditionally, they refuse. Anami speaks of a decisive battle on the homeland, of inflicting casualties so severe that the Americans will offer better terms. He does not speak of victory. He speaks of a death so costly to the enemy that it purchases something other than unconditional submission. The vote is 3-3. The deadlock is absolute. In the Japanese cabinet system of 1945, unanimity is required for policy decisions. A single dissenting minister can block action, and Anami dissents. The Imperial Conference convenes just before midnight on August 9th, extending into the early hours of August 10th. It is held in the underground shelter beneath the imperial palace, a cramped, humid room lined with wood panelling, lit by electric bulbs, where the most consequential figures in the Japanese government sit in formal dress and listen as the Emperor of Japan speaks. Hirohito's intervention is unprecedented. The Emperor does not, by tradition, decide policy. He ratifies consensus. But there is no consensus to ratify, and so Hirohito announces his support for acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. "I cannot bear to see my people suffer any longer," he says, or words to that effect. The precise phrasing varies slightly across accounts. "I must bear the unbearable." The Emperor has spoken. But the Emperor's word in August 1945 is not the same as the Emperor's deed. Between the sacred decision and its execution lies the entire apparatus of the Japanese military, an apparatus that has spent 4 years telling its soldiers that surrender is worse than death, that the Emperor's will is inseparable from the war effort, and that the homeland must be defended to the last man. For the war faction, the Emperor's decision is not a conclusion, it is a provocation. Maki Koichi Kido, Hirohito's closest advisor, records in his diary during these days a fear that grips the inner circle of the palace, the fear of a military coup. Allied leaflets have been dropped over Tokyo, publicizing the surrender negotiations, making it impossible for the army to pretend the war continues on favorable terms. Kido writes that the leaflets have caused him to be stricken with consternation, not because they reveal the truth to the Japanese public, but because they reveal it to the junior officers of the Imperial Army, who may decide that the Emperor has been misled, manipulated, surrounded by defeatists, and that the only patriotic course of action is to seize control of the palace, destroy the surrender documents, and continue the war. This is not paranoia. This is a reading of recent Japanese history. The army has launched coups before. In 1936, young officers murdered multiple cabinet ministers in an attempt to seize power. The tradition of Gekkokujo, rule from below, in which junior officers act on what they believe to be the Emperor's true will regardless of his stated orders, is embedded in the institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Army. And now, in August 1945, with the nation facing its most profound crisis, with the Emperor himself ordering surrender, the conditions for another such attempt are as ripe as they have ever been. American intelligence knows some of this, not all. The intercepts, Magic and Ultra, reveal fragments. The deadlock in the War Council, the conditional nature of Japan's initial offer, the resistance of the military faction. But the Americans cannot see inside the palace. They cannot read Kido's diary in real time. They cannot know whether an army will hold the line or whether the young officers beneath him will act on their own. What they can see is silence. What they can see is delay. The Burns note went out on August 12th. August 13th passes without a reply. And in that silence, in that absence of confirmation, the American command loop faces the same question it has faced since the morning of August 10th. Is this real? Is the surrender genuine? Can the Emperor deliver what he has promised? Or is the delay evidence that the militarists have prevailed, that the coup has succeeded, that the moderates have been silenced, and that the war will continue? This uncertainty, not cruelty, not indifference, but genuine strategic opacity, is the engine that keeps the bombers flying. Truman has made a private argument, articulated in meetings and memoranda during these days, that conventional pressure must be maintained until the surrender is confirmed beyond doubt. The logic is simple and, from the American side of the Pacific, defensible. If the Japanese are surrendering, the raids will end the moment the word arrives. If they are not surrendering, If the silence means failure, then every day without bombing is a day that allows the Japanese to regroup, to dig deeper into their defensive positions on Kyushu, to prepare for the invasion that will cost, by the most conservative estimates, tens of thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives. The cost of bombing a surrendering enemy is terrible. The cost of not bombing a fighting enemy, only to discover too late that the enemy was still fighting, is worse. And so the paradox holds. The cables cross. The Burns note travels toward Tokyo. The B-29s travel toward Kumagaya, toward Isesaki, toward targets whose names will not appear in most history books. And in Tokyo, in the underground shelter beneath the palace, the deadlock is not yet broken. On August 13th, Tokyo telegraphs its acceptance of the Burns note, but even this is qualified, conditional in ways that will require further clarification. The acceptance comes at 11 o'clock at night, Tokyo time, and it must still travel outward through the same diplomatic channels, the same Swiss intermediaries, the same layers of encryption and translation that have slowed every previous exchange. Anami, for his part, does not launch the coup that American intelligence fears. He does something more complex, more human, and ultimately more decisive. He refuses to support it. Junior officers approach him. They have a plan. They will seize the palace, isolate the emperor from his advisors, destroy the surrender recording before it can be broadcast. They need Anami's authority, or at minimum, his silence. And Anami, who has argued against surrender in every meeting, who has spoken of the decisive battle, who has refused to accept the Potsdam Declaration in any form, Anami tells his brother-in-law, in words that will survive him, "As a Japanese soldier, I must obey my emperor." On August 14th, Anami signs the surrender document with the rest of the cabinet. In the early hours of August 15th, before dawn, he commits seppuku, ritual suicide, in his residence. He leaves behind a death poem and a silence that speaks to the impossible position of a man who believed the war should continue, but believed more deeply that the emperor's word was final. His death is not a protest. It is a resolution. It is the only act available to a man who cannot support the surrender and cannot oppose it and cannot live in the space between. But Washington does not know this yet. Washington, on August 14th, knows only that the silence has been partially broken, that something resembling acceptance has come through the Swiss channels, and that the bombers are already airborne for what will become the largest single-day air operation of the Pacific War. The 1,000-plane mission is in the air. The code word Utah has not yet been transmitted, and the question that has haunted the Oval Office for 6 days, can the Emperor's word be trusted? Can his broadcast end this war? Can a single voice transmitted by radio silence 3.5 million soldiers remains for a few more hours unanswered? George Marshall does not share his private arithmetic with many people. The Chief of Staff of the Army is not a man given to theatrical pronouncements or public prophecy. He's a man of maps, of logistics, of the careful conversion of terrain and weather and enemy order of battle into numbers that mean something, that commit blood to a plan before a single soldier has crossed a beach. And in the summer of 1945, the number Marshall carries is large enough to justify almost anything. The plan is called Operation Downfall. It has 2 phases, named and sequenced with the precision of men who have spent 3 years learning how to put armies ashore on hostile coastlines. Operation Olympic comes first. November 1st, 1945, the assault on the southern third of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. The objective is not conquest but preparation, to seize the airfields and the anchorages that will support the second phase, Operation Coronet, the assault on Honshu itself, the drive toward Tokyo Bay. Coronet has no fixed date yet. It depends on Olympic succeeding. Olympic has no margin to fail. Marshall believes in downfall, not with enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is a quality he reserves for subordinates, but with the particular conviction of a man who has watched the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific long enough to know that no enemy surrenders until its armies are shattered or its homeland is at risk. Germany did not stop until Soviet and American forces stood in Berlin. Japan, in Marshall's reading of the evidence, will not stop until a comparable rupture occurs. A rupture so catastrophic that the Japanese High Command cannot plausibly continue to invoke decisive battle, cannot sustain the argument that the homeland can still be defended and the enemy bled white. That is the arithmetic Marshall carries into the second week of August, and that arithmetic does not evaporate when the Swiss cables arrive. It does not dissolve when the Burns note goes out. It does not lift when Tokyo signals acceptance on August 14th. Because Marshall, more than almost any other man in the American command loop, understands that acceptance is not surrender. Acceptance is a diplomatic communication. Surrender is a physical fact, signed, transmitted, obeyed by 3.5 million soldiers in China and Manchuria and the home islands and the scattered garrisons of the collapsing empire. Between the communication and the fact lies a gap, and in that gap, on the night of August 14th into the morning of August 15th, the American command loop holds its breath. The White House is illuminated well past midnight. Truman has already made his announcement at 7 in the evening, walked to the reporters gathered in the executive offices, and read out that the Japanese government had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, that a formal surrender would follow. The crowd outside Lafayette Park has begun to gather even as he speaks, growing block by block into something the White House police will describe as the largest spontaneous assembly in the city's memory. At 7:03, the moving illuminated band on the New York Times sign in Times Square flashes the 8 words that will define the evening in 1 million American cities. Official. Truman announces Japanese surrender. Confetti begins to fall from windows on Broadway before the sentence has finished its second revolution. But inside the White House, the celebration is muted. Truman receives a small delegation, accepts congratulations, shakes hands. He's photographed at his desk holding a paper. And then he does what he has done every night of this crisis. He returns to the private study, to the maps, to the message traffic. Because Washington's night is Tokyo's morning, and Tokyo's morning is the window in which the promise made through the Swiss must convert itself into an act performed on the airwaves of NHK. The Emperor has agreed to broadcast. The recording, according to what fragmentary intelligence has reached Washington, has been made. But the recording is a physical object, a set of lacquered discs, and it must travel from wherever it has been secreted to the transmitters at NHK, and the transmitters must be operating, and the country must be listening, and no one in the palace or the war ministry or the Kempitai must decide in the last available hour to intervene. Washington does not know, as Truman returns to his study, that intervention has already been attempted. It does not know that Major Kenji Hatanaka, a staff officer at the War Ministry who has spent the previous 48 hours attempting to persuade his superiors that the surrender must be prevented, has assembled a small band of like-minded officers and moved on the Imperial Palace in the darkness before dawn. It does not know that Hatanaka's men have shot the commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division when he refused to join them, forged orders in his name, seized the palace grounds, and begun a room-by-room search for the surrender recording, turning over cabinets, opening cupboards, questioning chamberlains at bayonet point. It does not know that the recording, hidden in a small safe in a room used by an Empress Dowager's staff, is not found. It does not know that another group of rebels has burned Prime Minister Suzuki's residence and gone hunting for Suzuki himself, who has slipped away minutes before their arrival. It does not know that Hatanaka has ridden to the NHK studios and, pistol drawn, ordered the announcer Morio Tateno to put him on the air so he can address the nation and denounce the surrender, and that Tateno, in one of the small acts of individual courage on which the ending of great wars sometimes turns, has refused. He has said calmly that he cannot do so without authorization from the military district. He has said this into the barrel of the pistol, and Hatanaka, after some minutes of argument, has lowered the weapon and walked out. By the time Truman is returning to his study, the coup is failing. General Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, has arrived at the palace in person and ordered the rebels to stand down. Some obey, some refuse. Hatanaka, riding through the streets of Tokyo on a bicycle in the first light of morning, distributes pamphlets denouncing the surrender to anyone who will take them, and then, understanding that the moment has passed, he shoots himself on the plaza in front of the palace. The other principal conspirator kneels beside him and does the same. The recording is still in its safe. The transmitters are still operating. Tateno is still at his post. None of this is known in Washington. Washington knows only what it has known since the Burns note went out on August 12th, that the Emperor's authority has been offered as a bridge, and that the bridge has not yet been walked. Truman's aides pass through the study with cables and coffee. Burns is somewhere in the building. Liehi is at his post. The signal corps operators in the basement transmit and receive on a schedule that has not been altered by the celebrations in the streets outside, and beneath the calculations of state, running underneath the diplomatic clock like a second, faster pulse, is the operational reality that no one in the room is discussing aloud but everyone is aware of. Karl Spaatz is still on Guam. The 20th Air Force is still at readiness. The third bomb has not been cancelled. It has only not been ordered forward, and the plutonium core for that third weapon is still at Los Alamos, awaiting shipment. On August 10th, Leslie Groves had written the memorandum stating that the next bomb should be ready for delivery on the first suitable weather after the 17th or 18th. Marshall had written on that memorandum in his careful hand the single sentence that governs everything that will happen or not happen. It is not to be released over Japan without express authority from the President. That sentence remains in force on the night of August 14th. It has not been rescinded. It has not been activated. It sits in the file like a switch that has been neither thrown nor removed, and Groves is still building toward the date on the assumption that the switch might be thrown. Spaatz, on Guam, is doing the work of a commander who's been given no reason to stand down. On August 14th he has cabled Washington again, pushing Tokyo as the target for the third weapon, urging with what his message calls the utmost urgency that the bomb be transferred to Tinian for use against the capital. He is not being ghoulish. He is being an air commander who has been told for months that the atomic weapons are the instrument that will end this war, and who has watched two of them fail to produce an unambiguous ending, and who reasons, as air commanders in 1945 reason, that the third placed on the seat of government will produce what the first two have not. His crews on the ground at Tinian have been briefed on nothing specific, but they know the routines of readiness. They have watched two special missions launch from their strip. They can see, without being told, that a third is being prepared for. And in the air, on the night of August 14th into the morning of August 15th, the last conventional operation of the war is still running. More than 1,000 B-29s have gone north from the Marianas, the maximum effort strike that has been in the air since Truman was walking to meet the reporters. Their targets are the ones that have been on LeMay's list for weeks: Koromo, where Toyota manufactures; Nagoya, again; Isesaki; Kumagaya; the rail yards at Marifu; the refineries at Akita; 7 aircraft from the 509th Composite Group, the Special Group, the Atomic Group, are flying conventional pumpkin bomb missions, the practice runs that have doubled as pressure since Nagasaki. The bombers do not know what has been announced in Washington. The bombers know their coordinates and their fuel loads and their return headings. They fly through the same Pacific night they have flown through for months, and below them, in the last hours of the war, cities burn that will be counted in no monument. At 200 Greenwich Civil Time on August 15th, the small hours of the morning in Washington, the afternoon in Tokyo, the moment when the last of the returning bombers are approaching the Marianas, a naval dispatch goes out under authority that reaches back through Nimitz and up through Marshall and ultimately to the President himself. The dispatch orders the cessation of offensive operations against the Japanese. It does not use the word peace. It uses the vocabulary of the operational order, a specific instruction transmitted through specific channels that undoes the standing authorization to strike. The message flows outward through the Pacific Command in the way that all such messages have flowed for 4 years, and where it reaches, the war stops. It does not stop everywhere at once. Aircraft already committed to targets complete their runs. Submarines on patrol receive the order at the intervals their radio schedules permit. Garrisons in China and Manchuria will not hear anything definitive for days. But the great machinery of strategic air operations, the machine LeMay has built into the most destructive instrument in the history of war, begins, with the cessation order, to wind down. There will be no maximum effort mission on August 15th. There will be no incendiary raid on the night of the 15th. The target folders remain on the desks unopened. And in Los Alamos on August 15th, Leslie Groves places a telephone call to Robert Oppenheimer. The call is brief. Groves has been informed that the third bomb is not to be shipped. Oppenheimer is told, in whatever words Groves selects for a secure line, that the plutonium core is not to leave New Mexico. The assembly line that has produced 2 weapons and was building toward a third simply stops. The core will remain in its container. The bomb components on Tinian will not be joined to a physics package. The mission planners will not be briefed. The target, whatever Spartz's cable urged and whatever the Oval Office contemplated, will not be struck. What had been a live weapon 8 days from deployment becomes, in the space of a telephone call, an object in storage. The dual voice broadcast has by then already gone out. At noon Japan Standard Time on August 15th, on frequencies coordinated through NHK. The recording made in the palace the night before is played to the nation. It is the first time in the history of Japan that the reigning emperor has spoken directly to his subjects over the radio. His voice, when it comes through the loudspeakers set up in factories and rail stations and public squares, is thin and hesitant. The voice of a man reading a text prepared for him, in a classical Japanese so formal that many of his listeners cannot follow the vocabulary. He does not use the word surrender. He speaks of accepting the provisions of the joint declaration of the powers. He speaks of the war situation having developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He refers, in a phrase that will be quoted for generations, to a new and most cruel bomb. The only direct acknowledgement in the broadcast of what has happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he arrives, near the end, at the sentence that will be inscribed on the ending of the war as certainly as any signature on any deck of any battleship. He has resolved, he says, to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. In the factories and the squares some Japanese kneel, some weep, Some do not understand what has been said and turn to neighbors to ask. Some understand and refuse to accept and go home and do what Tanami has already done. In the streets of Tokyo, the small fires of the coup are being put out. The bodies of Hatanaka and his companion are being carried off the plaza. The chamberlains and the palace staff are emerging from the rooms in which they have been hidden. And in the receiving stations of American intelligence, on Okinawa, on Guam, at Pearl Harbor, the broadcast is monitored, recorded, translated, and transmitted eastward to Washington, where its confirmation is what closes the loop that opened at 7 the previous evening. The stand-down cascade moves through the command structure with the deliberateness of a well-drilled organization. Arnold, in Washington, transmits the halt to LeMay on Guam. LeMay, who has been building target packages for the next week, sets them aside. Spatz, whose cable urging the third bomb has been overtaken by events, cancels the readiness posture for atomic operations. The 509th Composite Group is told, without ceremony, that there will be no third mission. The bombs already on Tinian in component form are, over the coming days, secured and inventoried and eventually returned. The crews who had trained for a mission they were never quite told the name of are released to other duties, then to home. The accounts of the American commanders who lived through these hours are, in the memoirs and the oral histories, curiously uniform in their strangeness. Relief is the word most of them reach for first, but relief is followed, almost immediately, by something harder to name. A professional deflation, a sense that the machinery which has run at maximum output for so long cannot simply be turned off without producing some equivalent of momentum in the men who operated it. LeMay will later write of the ending as an event that arrived faster than his organization was prepared to absorb. Spatz will speak of it more privately. The bomber crews, on the strips of Guam and Saipan and Tinian, will remember it as the day when the mission boards did not have new coordinates on them, and no one quite knew what to do with the silence. The war does not, of course, end on August 15th in the legal sense. The formal instrument of surrender will not be signed until September 2nd, on the deck of the Missouri in Tokyo Bay, with MacArthur presiding and the representatives of the Empire in their diplomatic morning coats, and the sound of 1,000 aircraft passing overhead, in a demonstration that is half salute and half final punctuation. But operationally, in the loop that has carried this narrative, in the loop that runs from Truman's desk to Marshall's map room, to Spatz's headquarters, to the bomb bays over Honshu, the war ends on August 15th. The cessation order is transmitted. The broadcast is verified. The third bomb is halted in place. The switch that Marshall's sentence had held in the neither thrown nor removed position is, at last, removed. What remains, when the operational story closes, is the accounting. 6 days. From the flash over Nagasaki at 11:02 on the morning of August 9th to the Emperor's voice on the radio at noon on the 15th, 6 days have passed. In those 6 days, the second atomic weapon has killed some 40,000 Japanese immediately and set in motion a slower dying that will bring the Nagasaki total by the end of 1945 to 74,000, a number that the medical follow-up over the succeeding months will extend to somewhere between 60 and 80,000 additional deaths from radiation, burns, and untreated injuries. In Hiroshima, the total for the year will reach an estimated 140,000, and the follow-on toll will add 90 to 166,000 more. Roughly half of all these deaths, in both cities, occurred on the day of the bombing itself. The rest are the arithmetic of a weapon whose effects extend past the moment of use, the slow disclosure of what has been done. In those same 6 days, the conventional bombing campaign that had been running against Japan since March did not pause. Between the morning of August 9th and the cessation order in the small hours of August 15th, LeMay's B-29s flew multiple missions against multiple cities. On August 14th alone, hundreds of aircraft struck Kuromo and Nagoya and the other targets on the maximum effort list, and the raids of August 14th and 15th killed thousands in Kumagaya and Isesaki, cities whose names entered the American record only as coordinates, and whose destruction, arriving after Tokyo had communicated acceptance of the Potsdam terms, has never fitted comfortably into any of the standard narratives of the war's ending. In those 6 days, a third atomic weapon came within 8 days of deployment. It was not cancelled by presidential order until after the Emperor's broadcast was verified. Between Marshall's sentence of